Good Friday afternoon. Shabbat Shalom and welcome to Living Water, calling deeper in love God's Word. I am one of your hosts, Lauren Cruz.
And I'm Stephanie Pavlantos. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. I'm going to give Stephanie a second to make sure she has everything shared to the correct
I think I do.
pages. Okay. And I'm just going to give you a heads up. I am not at my regular place. I have dogs over here that are going to go barking any minute. And I have grandkids being corralled by grandpa downstairs, and they've already got a meltdown at least once. So
oh no,
I apologize for our background noise. Such is life, right? That's life.
Yeah.
All right.
It happens.
It happens. It does. And I've got my fan blowing me. We are on, hello. We are on chapter 8 this week. We still have one more chapter.
One more and the conclusion, which the conclusion is short. But
right. I think we talked about having the two together. Mm-hmm. So we are going to record our last show on Monday.
Yes.
And we'll have that set up because Stephanie and I are going to be attending a Messianic Surge conference, the Messianic Women's Conference in Dallas next week. And so we will be having Shabbat with them because they've actually made a point to honor and to have Shabbat available, and meals will be pre-prepped and everything. So we're kind of looking forward to that.
And just know that we can't answer your questions online and
next week
live.
Right.
So you can put them there and we'll probably see them later, but we may not be able to watch it at the time. Right.
Yeah. So please do interact. Final thoughts on the book, final thoughts on the last chapter. And then the next week after that, I think we're talking about perhaps having a guest come on who has taught the book of Galatians, because we are going to be starting a new book.
Yeah.
And it is more of a Bible study style. It's the book of Galatians. And so we have a really good book that's been written that's a commentary / book study / Bible study.
Yeah. There's no question and answer in this. Nothing new. It's more or less, she has the passages, the verse by verse outlines here on this page, and then, or in the top first section. And then when you go to the second section, you have all the commentary. So it goes all the verses, so you can use it to write all your notes in and all of that. So
I think too, there's a website that we are both familiar with, Acts. What is it called?
It's an acronym. So it spells Acts, but you put a period, and I can put that. I will get that.
Right. We'll try to have that in our different show notes as we're going through. The reason we want to use that is they do a really great teaching on the book of Galatians, and we will likely reference some of the material that they are talking about. And so we just want to make sure you give them credit where credit is due. It's a website that is trying to start building out some classes and just additional information.
And it's free to join. So it's not difficult to get to. Everything's free. I think maybe eventually they might have some, but I'm on the site now, so they already have different classes already coming soon. So one is the deity of Yeshua, and that looks good. And kingdom identity, I thought that looked good.
That looks good too.
So I will actually give the link here too right now. I can put that.
We'll put that in our comments, just as a way to look ahead. We're just trying to make sure we have everybody. If you want to order the book and join us, we'll try to get that in the links too before we take off for this evening. And then, you have everything you need to continue to join us. And we just appreciate when folks are able to watch with us and interact and have questions. It's always good. So anyway, that's our information to our commercial pause. But we are continuing. We have 2 weeks left in Misreading Scripture with Western Eyes. We are on chapter 8 today. Easy chapter, pretty quick read. the title is Getting Right Wrong, and it talks about vices and virtues. And basically, they've kind of used those words as, things that we think are positive in the Christian life, things that we are acceptable, that we agree with, and then vices, they're really kind of defining more as sin. So I thought it was good.
And he starts out with that children's story, or you might even
Little Red Hen. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's interesting because, he just says here that so as he was going through here, he was like, as a believer, I'm taught to share. So we all know, that you give to anybody in need, and all of that from Acts 2. And then he says that in the Christian voice in my head says share with those in need. At the same time, though, the voice of the little red hen sounds in my mind. No, they didn't work.
Right.
And so another thing is, why does that beggar need change anyway? Isn't he just going to misspend it? Like he's giving examples of what we might do. So, but yeah, so that was interesting how he brought in that story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. He's doing, if you're not familiar with the Little Red Hen, she's like, oh, I think I'll grow some corn, grow some wheat. And then, oh, I think I'll use the wheat to make some bread. And then, it's just the work
and she asks all the different animals.
Yeah, who's going to help me? Not I. And then when she finally has this yummy bread, they're like, oh, I'll come help you. I'll come help you eat. And so the whole premise is, you haven't done the work. You don't get to enjoy any of the spoils or the victories of it. So the premise of that, though, is, aren't we supposed to be charitable? Aren't we supposed to help those in need? Aren't we and so that's the conflict of, is it a vice or is it a virtue?
Right.
And how much our society really impacts what we accept as a virtue, something good, or is it actually a vice? Is it something that goes against Scripture? And he actually goes into several examples of things that are considered not only not biblical, but some of them are anti-biblical. So I think that's interesting.
And surprisingly so, because in our Western culture, it sounds good.
Yeah, it sounds great. Like, yes, people are celebrated for it. So anyway, so that's kind of the premise of the book. Let's see. I wanted to go on page 178, and this kind of just the same thing of what we're talking about. It sets us up to it. It says, we are profoundly influenced by our culture to recognize certain behaviors as virtues and other behaviors as vices. And if you would think about it too, do you ask yourself, do you think the world feels the same? Is the same thought, is every culture going to support this as a vice or this as a virtue? So that was kind of what he's bringing to mind. I thought the next section was kind of interesting because he begins the whole discussion on, what do you think Jesus looks like?
That is interesting because we really, we've all grown up with pictures on our church walls, right? About like what we thought Jesus looked like, and he's always well kept, well groomed, clean, all his teeth.
Well, and they make the point, what if he had bad teeth? Do you ever think about that? And we surely not. He was perfect, right? He was the Son of God. But he was also very human. How tall was he? What color was his skin? Did he have dark hair or blonde hair? I have actually been in churches and we had blonde hair, blue-eyed Jesus. I've seen that picture on the wall. And
or tall Jesus. And
tall. Was he tall? Was he muscular? Or was he wimpy and skinny? What do you think?
He just looked average. Because, really, isn't it Isaiah that says, like, he wasn't much to look at. Like, nobody would have thought anything of him. And even the way Scripture goes on, like, why do you think, I think this is interesting, but we don't often think about it, but why did Judas have to kiss Jesus? He had to point him out. It was like the guards and the high priest didn't even know what he looked like.
He blended in. Yeah. So he wasn't taller. He wasn't taller than everybody, right? He wasn't this presence. I think it's funny. There's a funny line, but think about it. Can you imagine Jesus who doesn't have all his teeth? It seems like heresy to suggest it, and we're not going to get into a theological argument about it, but most of the world would wonder why Westerners have such a thing about teeth. Like he's making that example. People in Europe don't have, such a hang up on braces. I know. Yeah.
And you even look at like people in England, they're notorious for having
good teeth. Right.
And, you think of like some of the different singers they didn't have nice teeth. And, but we're obsessed with having nice teeth here in America. So not everybody is.
Right. Down at the bottom of page 179, he's got a really good quote. Of course, we like to believe that our conceptions of what constitutes a vice or a virtue comes from Scripture, right? Mm-hmm. We know what's right and wrong because Scripture tells us.
Right.
And sometimes it does, but we must be aware that through repetition over time, our culture shapes our understanding of vice and virtue at an unconscious level.
Yeah.
So, he even uses the phrase, don't smoke, don't chew, don't go with girls who do. We've heard that 100 times, especially me in the South, because that's considered, that's a vice. We can't accept those things.
Right. And it's interesting if you just go, he talked even about like hygiene.
Right.
And you would imagine that, they walked everywhere and they were dusty and dirty, and you don't think about they probably smelled. They all smelled, and it's interesting because we don't think about those things. And but yeah, it's really interesting to think about that, how subconscious these thoughts are ingrained in us, that Jesus had to look good, he had to smell good, of course he was strong, of course the Son of God, because what do we have all the Greek mythology, these
great gods,
these gods are muscular, big, nice looking men, so so of course Jesus would have to be big, muscular, nice looking, but
of course
but we just went over quickly, but that the whole thing at the bottom of 178 where God helps those who help themselves. I grew up on that.
Right. He uses a parable to kind of set things up and we'll get into this a little bit more, but he uses, they use a lot of parables in the book, and he addresses how we see things based on our Western view of what is acceptable and what is right, but really we're missing the complete point of the story. We're applauding somebody for something that really is not even the point of the story. So when we start talking a little bit about that, we'll get into it. Yeah. Okay. This was my favorite section, and I think we're gonna camp here for just a few minutes. But on page 180,
this is good.
It says prioritizing virtues and vices. And so my question to our listeners is, do you think there is a sin, one sin or two sins, or a list of sins that are considered worse than others? Like if you had to prioritize our sin or rank our sin, how would you do that? And I think that's something very Western, because we're trying to think like, oh, well, I know I'm a sinner, but I'm not as bad as that person.
Exactly. My husband would tell me, even before he was a believer, he went to a Greek Orthodox church, and he goes, there was always someone worse than me. And he was into a lot of different things. And so he was like, there was always someone worse. And I never thought anything of that. I never thought I was as bad as them, but I was bad, in the real sense. He had some, he did, I can't even talk about it, but he did bad stuff, but he still never saw himself as bad as somebody else.
There's always somebody worse, right?
And we still think that today. But if we look at, I think a lot of believers actually probably would say like homosexuality is like one of the worst sins if we had to prioritize things. Maybe murder's up there, but homosexuality is certainly up there.
Right. And I think Lucille said, the worst sin is not loving God. People forget. That's the life or death sin, right? Like not having a relationship with God.
what we do and what we think of as sin
Right.
in the church among people. Yeah, definitely we could. Yeah, I mean, like the 10 Commandments, but then even the 10 Commandments, well, some people say, well, it was just a little white lie. I can't, think about it.
And think about
telling somebody they look good in a dress when they don't, or they look good in an outfit, or their hair looks nice when it doesn't. Is that lying? So we kind of prioritize those things even.
And think about different, even within denominations, like we all read the same Bible, but some denominations are accepting of certain behaviors, and others will beat you down at the pulpit if you engage in any of those behaviors. So that, there's that to contend with as well. Well, the reason we're kind of bringing on this conversation, asking about it, is on page 180, the authors begin to really explain a very unique way of teaching that was very Greek and very Roman, very Romanesque of the time, very popular, typical, not out of the ordinary at all. And what it is when Paul is writing to the various churches, and he's kind of making lists of behaviors. And the one that they give us, put on and take off. You're a new man, put on and take off. And it's not so much the analogy of clothing, because obviously there's a metaphor of getting dressed, so you're putting on things and you're taking off things. That's typical, and we kind of tend to just pick up on that because that's something we're familiar with. And we're thinking that this whole list of stuff that he's really trying to make sure we understand, all this list of sins and all these, this is all sin and we shouldn't engage. But what he's doing by doing those lists is he's engaging in a very typical teaching method. And we get stuck. We major on the minors, if you will. We get stuck on this list, and we're not understanding really what the main point is. And so they say, among the philosophers of Paul's day, it was common to state virtues or vices in lists of 5, and then it's often followed by one that summarizes the whole list. So when you're talking about virtues and vices, a list of 5 is not uncommon. These are all the vices, or these are all the virtues. But the last one, the 5th one or the 6th one, that's really the main point. That's the main point. And he's just kind of using this list as examples of how it shows up in your behavior. But then this is what it is. So I wanted to read a certain passage and count. Let's count out what he's talking about. Let's see if we can find an example of it. So he says Colossians 3:5. So I have Colossians 3:5. And it's the consequences of setting your mind on what's above and not on what I'm trying to give you the content. Set your mind on what's above, not what is on the earth, for you have died and your life is hidden with the Messiah. And then this is how you kind of apply it. Okay, ready? Therefore, put to death what belongs to your worldly nature. Here's the list. Okay, put to death sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed. Okay, there's your list of 5. But here's the main point, which is idolatry. So it's not so much put to death all these other things. Yes, put them to death, but because those are examples of idolatry. And if you think about it, if you've got impurity, sexual immorality, lust, evil desires, and greed, that's putting your thoughts and wishes, which is idolatry. You're becoming more important than living a godly life. So it says idolatry. Because of these, God's wrath comes on the disobedient, and you once walked in those things. So he's still acknowledging this list, but it's because we walked in pride. We walked in what we wanted before we put God first. So I think it's a good thing.
The next one is Colossians.
But now we must also put away the following. He's got more. Put away these two. So here's another list: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and filthy language from your mouth. Do not lie to one another. So that's the thrust. Do not lie to one another. How do you lie to one another? You do it in anger. You do it when you use coarse language, when you're malice, when you're slandering each other. Like, think about what slander is. You're putting somebody else down, and you're speaking against their God-given
lies about their personality, their character, whatever.
Right. So it's all of those put-offs are very important, but the thrust is don't lie. Don't lie. So I thought that was interesting.
Lori is on another, she's on the Discovering Our Hebrew Roots.
Okay.
So she said, yeah, that's quite a list. So I'm just checking other places that people are commenting.
Perfect. Yeah, it's not that they're not important. I mean, yes, that is a behavior that we should, as Christians, we should not be emulating and using that behavior. But we get so hung up on don't cuss, right? Or don't use coarse language. Yes, we shouldn't be. I agree. However, it's that we shouldn't be lying, and we shouldn't be speaking against others, and we shouldn't be, we should have the self-control not to be able to say those things against people. So I think it's
I found some in Galatians, but they're not 5, but they are kind of grouped.
Okay.
And these are common verses. Everybody will know them. But in Galatians 5, we have the fruit of the Spirit, which is the good list. But before that, we have the works of the flesh. And
you want to read through those?
Yeah. So it says, now the works of the flesh are evident: sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality. So those are 3 of one group. So then the next group: idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, revelries, dissensions, divisions, and envy. Those kind of some of those go
12,
together.
right? We're up to 12 things. He's listing.
Yeah, and then drunkenness, orgies, and things like these. So those are the last 2. So you kind of have idolatry, sorcery, kind of together, but then you have enmity, strife, jealousy, anger, and that's all that, like that, with 2 people. That all has to do with 2 or more people, dissensions, divisions, and stuff like that, and envy. So that's one group. So you have like 3 groups there. But then on the flip side of it, he says, now here's the fruit of the Spirit. And of course, we know there's 9 of those. So love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. And then he says, against such things, there is no law. So self-control, right, being the last one.
Right.
We can see self-control, or the lack. Excuse me. We can see self-control being the works of the flesh, being like the antithesis of the works of the flesh. Because none of those, drunkenness, none of those have to do with self-control.
Right. And the list of the others is only done through self-control.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I wanted to read this other part too, because I think it's important to note. Now I want to go and read all the New Testament and find all the lists, right? It says we need to be sure to notice what Paul wanted us to notice, right? This is kind of sums up what we're talking about. First of all, we'd be missing the point if we only focus on the verbs. Paul uses a common language. We call it a clothing metaphor. When he talks about taking off and putting on, technically we say the same thing. This imagery was not Paul's point. It went without being said. Like, we know that we know he's using that imagery to make this point. Second, we should also not focus on the fact that Paul listed 5. So she was worried. She was reading off a list of 9 and she was saying other things. 5 was, there's nothing, it's not a sacred number. There was nothing,
Right.
You could have had more. It isn't an allegory, like referencing 5 all the time is not making a specific point. It was merely a Greek custom for describing vices and virtues.
Mm-hmm.
It's merely a Greek custom to make lists.
Yeah.
And the lists were not intended to be exhaustive, exemplary, or progressive. Like there's no, we're starting at the bad and getting to the worst. They were not, and they're not the only vices, right? There's
Right.
much more that could have been described. In Paul's day, it went without being said that a great way to describe something was to make a list.
Mm-hmm.
So he seems to emphasize sins of speech. That's the emphasis. Look for the themes. Right. So we looked at the sexual immorality. We looked at lying lips. We looked at all these other, look for the theme. Okay. So
yeah. And just like we did with Galatians.
Right. Yeah. The Colossians were probably having trouble with sins of the speech, speaking against each other. The main point Paul was making is that we need to be removing vices and adding virtues in an ongoing quest of godliness. So,
yeah. And I think we get that wrong in not vices over virtue, but that we realize that they really are vices.
Right.
That we realize, like, there was something on Facebook that I shared about holiness.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as a country, we really don't get what it means to be holy. But if you turn to Hebrews, it tells us in, I want to say chapter 12, but it could be 13. But he says, pursue peace, like really go after it. I shared before the word pursue. It's like really go after it as if you're persecuting, it's that kind of thing. If you want to persecute someone, how you go after them. And so it's pursue peace, but also holiness, without which you will not see God. So it's pretty important. And the Lord does want us to get rid of these vices. And it's so when we see lists stuff like that, I've been told by people, we cuss all the time. It doesn't matter. So, but it really does.
It does.
The Bible says it does.
Right. So. I think what you were just saying is a great point that goes to this next point he's making. It's the next page on 182. It says our second tendency is to emphasize vices and de-emphasize virtues.
Yeah.
So exactly what you were saying. Like we're told what not to do all the time. We're told, well, not so much. I will say this, not so much. You don't hear about sin as much anymore in the churches, but the problem is they don't emphasize your virtues. They don't emphasize a life of holiness. Yeah. They don't emphasize, so we're kind of losing both. And here's the thrust. He says in scripture, the godly life is portrayed as a lifelong work. Yeah. It's not just a list of do's and don'ts. It's not
and that's a good sentence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
active pursuit of virtue is what we should be doing. Active pursuit.
Right. Yeah. So people do not understand what's holy today. That's so true. That is so true. And I think it kind of leads into.
I don't think people understand. I don't think people understand what's holy.
I don't either. Yeah. And I think we've Americanized God, if you want to, of this, and this is something we're going to talk about next. Very tolerant, very accepting, loves all, hyper grace and loves everybody. And I've even seen, in comments, people are like, oh, well, Jesus wouldn't act like that. Yeah. Jesus called people whitewashed tombs, right? He called them sons of the devil. There's a line. There's definitely a line.
Someone had posted a female pastor talking about, like, if Jesus were here today.
The Beatitudes, how they changed the Beatitudes about abortion.
Blessed be those who aborted their babies And it's
for their kind.
Yes.
Yeah, I was shocked. And it was a pastor. It was a female pastor from the pulpit.
Yes.
I was mortified.
Yeah. I know. It's like there are people in churches, I say.
Yeah, loosely.
Yeah. But teaching that. And right. It's sickening. It's
a sad thing.
You have to be. And I think that one of the bigger issues is we're not in the Word today for ourselves. And just like he's pointing out, we look at it, and the next chapter is good because I already started reading 9, but it's about finding the center of God's will, and I'm not going to talk about it, but it's really good because it talks about some of these same issues. It's like we cannot keep reading the Bible as if it's all about me,
us, right?
All about you, or taking things out of context. It's just we can't do it. It's right. It's just wrong.
Right. Okay, good segue, because the next half of the chapter goes into topics that we as Americans have accepted as virtues. Like, these are great things, and we should strive for these things as Americans. Like, it's very common. The problem is some of them they're not in the Bible. We've created this list of virtues, and they're not actually in the Bible. And worse, some of them are actually anti-biblical. Yeah, but we've embraced them. So he's got a couple. I'll run through them, and then we can kind of talk about them. Self-sufficiency. He talks about that. He talks about fighting for freedom. How actually it's not a virtue to fight for freedom. Pax Americana, right? Peace in American, leadership. Our Western idea of a good leader and leadership, and how what we think as Westerners is very different than what Jesus taught and exemplified. And I actually took a class about that, and that was an interesting class to have to take in seminary. This is a whopper: tolerance. How we as Americans just beat the drum on tolerance and acceptance, but is it actually biblical, and is it or is it anti-biblical? Let's see. So self-sufficiency, freedom, leadership, and tolerance are all virtues we will likely teach to the next generation. But it should be clear, not all of our Western virtues come from the Bible, even if we insist that the Bible is an authority for moral conduct. So we can go back and kind of break some of those down.
Yeah, self-sufficiency was the first one. And he talks about how we have less respect for people who are born into wealth than we do, and he uses the idiom that we have more respect for someone who pulls himself up by his bootstraps. So, works hard and attains wealth or attains success. But I would even say, when was this book? I guess I want to see what year this book was written, because 2012. So it's 12 years old.
Right.
Because that has even degraded since he wrote this, because I know when we were in the restaurant business, my husband worked really hard, and this business was his parents. And then he started working there. Well, he worked there all his life. And even as a 6-year-old, he was doing dishes. And then at 16, started running it full time, trying to do college, and that didn't even get to finish college. But he had the restaurant until, 2007 or so. But the thing is he worked really hard, and he was there all hours of the day and all hours into night. But yet some of our employees really resented him and thought that, he should do handouts and that he should give them. And so we had employees stealing from us and whatnot. So things have kind of gotten worse, but it was, in that there's that entitlement. I'm entitled to what you have.
Right. So. And it's not, he even makes a point in here. It's not that Jesus spoke against savings. Jesus didn't rebuke anybody. So the parable that he gives is the man who had a bumper crop and had so much excess that he said, "Oh, I think I better build a bigger barn. What am I going to do? I don't know what I'm going to do with all this excess. I better build a bigger barn."
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that Jesus rebuked him from having storage and having a savings, but rebuked him for thinking that he needed to build a bigger barn, because he did have something he could have done with the excess. He could have shared and saved, people that are hungry. It's not that it's a problem of saving. It's not a problem of being a good steward. It's not a problem of, making sure you have what you need. And they even use the example in Proverbs where, look at the ant. The ant works hard because he's storing things and he's putting things away. Yeah. You can look at Joseph, the story of Joseph, where he knew there was going to be famine and you needed to store and put things away. The problem is when that becomes your main focus and there are people in need, and yet you still put that above and beyond. Your self-sufficiency is more important than the needs of others. That's the problem.
And that's on 187. But he says that where saving seems like a virtue to us,
right,
Jesus considered it greed in that situation.
Right, and that's what that's the point. Is it greed? Does it borderline on greed? Mm-hmm. So I thought that was interesting.
And he does mention, I think you mentioned this, but I just wanted to say it again. But these lists that we're giving right now, these ones with self-sufficiency and all that, starting with that, he says they're non-biblical or abiblical. So they're actually anti-biblical.
Yeah.
So
fighting for freedom. It's readily accepted in America, public discourse, and American Christians. Freedom is worth fighting for. I mean, everybody thinks that.
Oh, that's very American, isn't it?
Very American, yeah. And so that was, something. When a Roman soldier strikes you, turn the other cheek. That's some of the teaching. Jesus didn't think so, and he would have joined. He could have joined the Jewish resistance, right? They expected him to come as a warrior against Rome. And
that's what they were. Yeah, exactly.
So, talking about, he kind of used the example of, we grew up with John Wayne, and, John Wayne would always fight back and always, go for the underdog. But in this case, he doesn't want us to, John Wayne would not have fled for the hills. He would have stood and fight. But in this case, we would, we actually prefer how John Wayne would have handled things instead of how Jesus would have handled things. So, anyway, another one is Pax Americana. Yeah. And, Jesus meant by the world, it was plastered and engraved in columns. Pax Roma. Rome had indeed brought peace to the part of the world, and for the first time, ships can go into the Mediterranean. Travelers could travel more freely, but the troubles start. The Roman military was there to stop it, and so they're using that as an example of, America is supposed to be a land of freedom and peace, and we shouldn't struggle and have these, we should do everything we can to have peace. Listen, I agree with that. I understand that. However, the point is, Jesus didn't come to bring peace.
I don't give it to you as the world gives to you, is what he says. And so that's what the verse says. So it's not the kind of peace that we want.
Right. And he even brings up the point, Paul states it's possible as far as it depends on, live at peace with everyone. We're not, trying to avow pacifists. We're not trying, raising objections to American peace. But we need to stop writing scripture verses on the sides of bombs, right? Where they're rather confident that the practice would not meet the what would Jesus do criteria. So,
right. And I love the next one too. So leadership and follower, because I mean, we value leadership.
Mm-hmm.
We value people who are leaders.
Mm-hmm.
And but what's more important, to follow Jesus, to actually follow those who are doing it right. Just like even Paul writes, some follow Apollos, some follow Paul, some follow Peter, but he goes, follow me as I follow Jesus, follow me as I follow Yeshua, because that's what we're supposed to be doing. So being a follower can, like my husband always will like to say stuff like, 95% of the population are followers.
Right.
There's only this, 5% or even less that are actual leaders.
Yeah.
And, he always makes a point of saying stuff like that.
Well, they make a point. It says, for many Westerners, the term follower connotates a weakness of character.
Yes.
When they cannot resist peer pressure and they go along with the crowd. Follower connotates a lack of creativity, ambition, portraying the average worker as a drone. By contrast, the term leader connotates, a constellation of virtues. Right. It implies that person is efficient and creative and has is charismatic. And
it's true. Businesses want to hire leaders, not followers. And it's true. They always ask you, how are you a leader? How will you show us your leadership skills? And there's Facebook groups dedicated to leadership. Christian leaders.
Yes.
Christian women in leadership. It's all out there. It's like, and then he says, well, that some people will try to kind of bring it back down biblically by saying, let's be a servant leadership.
Yeah.
But no, but Jesus really talks about it's more important to be a servant.
Right. And Lucille had several comments, serving others, servanthood, and, he truly emulated servant leadership. And honestly, I think that's probably one of the best leaders. I know I talk about being a teacher and all of, I've been teaching for a long time, but I've been under a principal now for probably 10 years out of my 16 years of teaching, who 100% emulates servant leadership. She acts and treats others the way she wants our school to look. And, how she will bend over backwards to assist somebody. Her husband and two teenage boys are on our campus doing landscaping, painting buildings. She and her husband, at each quarter, they have a pancake breakfast. They're there at 4:00 in the morning making pancakes to feed to the various sports for that quarter, whatever the sports was. She is there. So, good. She does that. And this is kind of funny, but she finishes every day. She does daily announcements, and she says, make it a great day or not, the choice is yours. Go get them, Panthers. And that's something we say every day at our school. The choice is yours. You're going to make it a great day or not. So that's mentally how you're going to do it. But then she is out there serving people. So she's a great example. And Yeshua did the same thing. He definitely. He was with the less than. He was with the uncommon and unexpected. And the Pharisees didn't like that, right? The Pharisees had their vices and their virtues.
And they were proud and they wanted to be noticed. And I think we talked about one week in here, that's why they killed him, because he destroyed their honor. And it was and it's funny because someone even mentioned to me twice in the last couple of weeks, and I don't know if he's watching this, but he's like, we have to go back to that. It was a honor shame society, and what happened was about honor and shame. And we went to we had a death in the family this week, and my husband's side of the family is all Greek. And I said, how amazing it was to see everyone, like all of the family. It's a big family. And they were my husband's cousins mainly. But all the family was, I mean, they're so close, but all their kids have been raised to love each other, to be loyal to each other. There's no prodigal children in this family. There's no, you don't hear of any problems and all of that. And it's just like I said, how awesome is it to see how much this huge family, all love each other? Because you would expect there to be a black sheep. You would expect there to be a problem maker, somebody. And not that those things probably never happen, but it's a great representative of not wanting to bring dishonor to the family or shame to the family. Right. And that's how they live their life. But
that's great.
But I said, but the thing is that they don't know Jesus personally.
Right.
And what
so good people, moral. Yeah.
But what a shame it is, because in the church, we see broken families. We see a lot of broken families. We see a lot of backbiting and prodigal, so it rang, it was just very clear to me. It's like, why isn't the church more like this? But there's broken people everywhere, obviously.
Right. All right. Well, the last one they talk about is tolerance.
Yeah.
I think this is a sticky one. And he actually states, this is like right in the middle of the paragraph, tolerance is clearly not a biblical virtue. God declared to his people, because of their tolerance, I am determined to bring disaster on you, to destroy all of Judah. Western Christians feel the tension of wanting to affirm the uniqueness of Christ and the truth of the gospel, while at the same time being perceived as tolerant of the beliefs of others. Right. And think about what America was founded on was Christian or religious freedom, which means if I've created this system that I want you to be tolerant of my faith, then I've got to be tolerant of everybody's faith. Everybody has to have the same freedoms.
Right.
And so
it's 100%.
We set up our country to have freedom, but yet we're intolerant, so we have to be tolerant of it. So
yeah. And I'm going to show here Nettie was talking about adoption, and this is a very good example of even I think maybe shame and honor, because adoption doesn't happen in a lot of Asian countries. My daughter was in some Asian countries and there's no adoption. These children, if a family member doesn't take them, you do not take someone who is not of your same blood.
Wow.
And of course this was like in Vietnam and stuff, and I assume that maybe Japan's somewhat like it, but the children aren't adopted. If they're not taken in by another family member, they're put into an adoption home, and they stay there all their lives until they're old enough to live.
Right.
And it's really a shame, but it's how different, the countries are, because it's unfortunately it's not, it's different. So
right. Yeah, it's that's a sad thing, but then think about if you are in a shame-based society and you didn't have your son, or you had more than one child, or I'm trying to think of different reasons why people would not, they would shun those children. So yeah.
But my daughter told me that even like anyone with a disability, especially being in Vietnam, some of those people had problems because of Agent Orange, and so they were shunned.
That makes sense. Yeah, that totally makes sense.
Shunned.
Yeah.
And we don't think that way in our culture. A child's a child and all that. So
right. I guess a final idea on tolerance is, they use the verse, enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction. Enter through, and many enter through it, but small is the gate, narrow is the road that leads to life. And that's Matthew 7:13-14. So yes, we want tolerance and acceptance, and everyone is welcome, and everyone is welcome. However, the process it is a lifelong work of living a life of holiness. And we just check off yeses and no. Think about a quiet time. Like, did I really have a quiet time today? Sure I did. It's on my list. Check.
Yeah.
But did you really invest in that time? So
right.
The last of the chapter is really ignoring some other virtues, and he kind of gives us just a different mix of various proverbs. The whole thing is it's the parable of the rich fool is difficult because Jesus mentions becomes uncomfortable, close to undermining things that we think are important. Tradition, what we call virtues, right? So that's part of the problem is when the Bible really begins to speak against things that we believe are important, we tend to not wrestle with those things. We just kind of go with the norm or go with what we've accepted. So
one that I see here is about wasting, and I want to make a comment about waste. Sure. As Americans, we're very wasteful.
Yeah.
And when you think of people in other country, and there are people in this country, of course, that dumpster dive, and they will get food out of dumpsters that, and when you see restaurants throw away food, and I know I've even seen reels and such that where even pet stores throw away all these things, and before they throw them away, they break them.
Shred them so nobody else
can't be used by somebody else. Like can't give to a shelter, break them up and destroy them so a shelter, somebody can't take them to a shelter and use them, have them used by. But even food, it's like there's a bread place here in where I live, and they would always take the extras and give them to charity.
That's great.
And anything that didn't sell, even if it was a day old, because here, what do? I mean,
right.
Yeah, my daughter brought home a whole half of a brisket when she worked for a place here, a restaurant, years ago, because they couldn't use what they had to throw it away. They couldn't use it. And she was just like, there's nothing wrong with this brisket. You're going to throw it away. Because in our family, you don't waste anything. I mean, we have chickens and all that, but if an egg is even slightly, cracked or something, my husband will eat it himself, that day. I mean, it's not an egg you can let sit around because it will go bad. But if he catches it on the day, he'll eat it that day for breakfast because he just can't throw, he can't be wasteful like that.
Yeah.
But I mean, but I just know so many people, and, it really is a problem. And we may look at it that we have so much that we can waste, and that's a virtue, but it really is a vice, in my opinion. So
I agree. I think that's a good point you made. It might look good that we have so much available to us that we can waste it. Like that's a good thing, but it's not. It is a waste. Yeah. I agree with that. Yeah, and it makes me sick. And I don't dumpster dive, but I watch the reels as well, and I'm shocked at what is thrown away in America.
Well, and have you seen? I mean, okay, so I'm getting off tangent here, but baby chicks that don't sell, they burn them.
Oh, wow, that's not okay.
No, it's terrible. I know it's
that's not okay.
But they throw them away and
just
set a fire, throw them in the fire.
That's sad.
And it's like, is there not some charity, somebody you could give them to that would raise them and feed somebody else with them? I mean, it's really difficult to imagine what we do with things we don't want, and instead of giving it away to somebody who could actually use it. It's really a shame. But
and I think that's the whole thrust of that parable. What am I going to do? I have too much. I better build more barns. Instead, look around you. It's not bad to save things. It's not bad to prep things. But if it comes to a point that you're going to throw it in the garbage versus making an effort to go find who could benefit from that, that's the problem.
Yeah, we waste and there's. My husband takes stuff to Salvation Army once a month. They collect stuff, and they will fight over it because they were wanting clothing,
Wow.
they're needing socks. You know, these are some of the homeless people who come to where they know we're going to be, and they want clothes. They want.
It's amazing.
Yeah. And one lady had a fire, you know, and she was so thankful that my daughter had taken some clothes, and they were all her size.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so she was able to have like all these nice jeans that my daughter had outgrown.
Wonderful.
And wear them and stuff like that. So
wonderful.
People are needy, and before you just waste, I think we need to find people who can use it. But it's easier to throw it away.
Yeah. Yeah. I think so. All right. Well, we have about 2 minutes left.
Yep.
And I think we're really that's kind of the thrust of what he's talking about, you know, vices and virtues. I'm trying to think if I underlined. I did have some. How do I start to recognize this in my life? Begin with yourself. This is on page 190. Start paying attention to your instinctive interpretation as you read the Bible. That have to do with vices or virtues. And as you read, are you skipping over virtues and vices that you don't like? Are you considering some very serious and others almost optional? Be sensitive to what the biblical author is trying to emphasize. In Colossians, Paul offers that list, belong to earthly nature, you know, and he's got through greed and idolatry. And if we argued about the above, lists are summarized by their final item. Paul is emphasizing idolatry. That's not a vice that we talk about much in American Christian.
And we think that like even gluttony it's not a vice.
Well, then he made a point. He actually started the chapter by saying, you know, there was a very famous American pastor who was
sin of pride or something.
Yeah, he had the sin of pride, and people rallied to have him step down, and they kind of made the point like, why aren't we rallying for our pastors to step down for gluttony? Like, is one sin or vice worse than the other?
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah.
So it's really so. But yes, Lucille had to sign off. But thank you for watching, and thank you for being part of the conversation, everyone. We appreciate you guys.
Yep, thank you.
But remember, next week we will not have a live show.
Right.
So.
All right. So thank you for joining us, and we'll finish up our book, and we'll begin our next one. So Shabbat Shalom. If you missed today's show and want to watch it again, or want to tell someone where they can watch this episode, go to lambnetwork.tv, where you will find this show and all of the other live Lamb show archives on the on-demand section of the website. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to tell someone about the Messianic Lamb Network.
We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussions, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the lambnetwork.tv website. I'm Stephanie Pavlantos, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.